In January of 1944, the Luftwaffe lost more pilots than it received from its training schools. Not aircraft, pilots. Galland had that number on his desk the same day it was compiled. He was sitting in his Berlin office, a cigar burning down in the ashtray, the January cold coming through the window frame behind him. He picked up a pen and wrote the report in the careful, deliberate language of a man who had learned that imprecise language gives people room to ignore you. Sent it up the chain. Göring read it and had it classified. In February, the gap got wider. In March, wider still. By April, Galland put it in writing officially, formally, on the record, in language that left no room for interpretation. Between January and April, he wrote, the day fighter arm had lost over 1,000 pilots. Squadron commanders, group commanders, wing commanders. The best ones. Every single raid, he said, was costing them roughly 50 aircrew. The time has come, he wrote, when our weapon is in sight of collapse. Göring's response was to demand more aggression. Galland had the data, he had the plan, he had the rank and the record to be heard. And for 2 years, while the fighter arm he'd spent his career building was being ground down mission by mission, he couldn't stop it. The question worth sitting with is a personal one, about this specific man in this specific moment. Why was Adolf Galland, the most informed fighter commander Germany had, listening through a telephone receiver from a hallway, while his best pilots were punished for telling the truth he'd been telling for 2 years? To understand how Galland ended up holding a telephone receiver in a hallway in January of '45, listening through an open line to his best pilots confront the man who was destroying them, we need to go back about 18 months, to the autumn of '43, and the first time he tried to tell Göring something Göring didn't want to hear. But before that, we need to spend a moment with what the Luftwaffe was actually facing that year, because the context matters. By the summer of 1943, the Americans were sending hundreds of heavy bombers over Germany every week. B-17 flying fortresses, slow, high, flying in tight defensive formations in broad daylight. The doctrine behind this was built on a specific belief. A properly armed formation of bombers creates an interlocking field of defensive fire so dense that no single-engine fighter can survive long enough to press an attack home. The bombers would protect themselves. It was a clean theory. The math behind it was worked out carefully at the Army Air Force's Tactical School at Maxwell Field in Alabama. The problem was that the math hadn't been tested against the real thing. On the 17th of August, 1943, the 8th Air Force sent 376 B-17s in 2 streams. One toward the Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg, the other toward the ball bearing plants at Schweinfurt, which supplied roughly half of all rolling bearings in the German war economy. It was the deepest penetration raid the Americans had ever attempted. The P-47 Thunderbolt escorts flew with them as far as Aachen, right to the German border, and then turned back. They had no more fuel. The bomber crews watched the friendly fighters bank away and knew what came next. The Luftwaffe had been waiting. The German fighter controllers had watched the escorts on radar, held their units at distance, and the moment the P-47s turned for home, they came down. 60 B-17 did not land that day. 60 out of 376, that's 1 in 6 aircraft gone in a single afternoon. 2 months later, the Americans went back. October 14th, Schweinfurt again. 291 bombers. No long-range escort because there was no long-range escort to send. 60 more bombers shot down. 17 more scrapped after landing, too badly torn up to fly again. More than 600 American airmen killed, wounded, or captured in one mission. The American press called it Black Thursday. General Ira Eaker, commanding the 8th Air Force, wrote in his after-action report that the daylight bombing campaign over Germany had effectively collapsed. Deep penetration raids were suspended. Göring had the intelligence summaries read to him at Karenhall, his estate north of Berlin, the one with the art on the walls and the model railway in the basement. He listened, set down his fork, and told his adjutant that the Americans had proven his point. Daylight precision bombing without fighter escort was a fantasy. The Reich was defended. The main thing now was not to relax. He went back to his lunch. Galland was reading the same numbers 300 kilometers away and reaching a completely different conclusion. Adolf Josef Ferdinand Galland was born on the 19th of March 1912 in Westerholt, Westphalia. His family had French Huguenot ancestry. His first ancestor in Germany had been a refugee from France in 1792. His father was an estate manager. His mother's family had been in the same part of the world for generations. He started flying at 17, gliders from a hill near his house. He soloed and said afterward that it was the most important moment of his life. Not his first kill, not his 100th, the first solo glider flight from a field in Westphalia in 1929. By 32, he was the youngest general in the German armed forces. By 33, he commanded every fighter pilot in Germany. The man who held that command didn't look like a staff officer. He had a broken nose from one of 2 serious training crashes early in his career, the first of which put him in a coma for 3 days. Slicked back black hair, a matching dark mustache, and a cigar that seemed to be permanently either lit or in his hand. His Bf 109 on the Channel Coast in 1940 had a Mickey Mouse painted on the nose. The men under his command thought that was about right. There was something in him that was genuinely hard to intimidate. That's worth pausing on, because Galland wasn't a political appointment. He didn't get those positions because he knew the right people or said the right things at the right dinners. He got them because he'd been in the air over Spain with the Condor Legion, then over France, then over England in the Battle of Britain, flying that Bf 109 personally, over the Strait of Dover, in the tightest and most lethal air combat the world had seen to that point. He'd been shot down 4 times. 4 times he climbed out and went back up. By the time he was appointed General of the Fighter Arm in November of 41, replacing Werner Mulders, who had just been killed in a transport accident, he had 96 confirmed kills and more than 700 combat sorties. The Luftwaffe command promptly forbade him from flying combat missions. Too valuable. Too much classified knowledge in his head to risk losing him. He kept flying anyway, quietly, without authorization, whenever he could manage it. That habit mattered in the autumn of 43, because it meant that when Galland said he understood what was happening over Germany, he wasn't reading it off a map. He was seeing it with his own eyes. In that autumn, when the American raids were grinding deeper and deeper into the Reich, Galland flew over Magdeburg. He wasn't supposed to. He went anyway. 4 Mustangs, new ones with Merlin engines, machines he hadn't properly seen before, cut him off from his formation. He pushed the nose down, pulled a trick he'd been using since 1940, fired his guns, let the smoke trail back toward the pursuing fighters. The Mustangs broke off. He landed, taxied in, and sat for a moment in the cockpit before climbing out. Just sat there, engine ticking as it cooled, thinking about what those 4 aircraft had just done to him. Then he went inside and wrote the report. A few weeks before that flight, in September of 43, German soldiers found the wreckage of an American single-engine fighter near Aachen, right on the western edge of Germany. Stars on the wings, American markings, nothing that should have been able to get that far under its own power. Galland had the wreckage brought to Göring. He laid out what it meant. American fighters were now reaching German territory. That meant they were working on range. It meant drop tanks, extended fuel, longer legs. It meant that if the Americans kept pushing in that direction, and there was every reason to believe they would, the day would come when those fighters could escort bombers all the way to the target and all the way back. If that happened, Galland said, Germany would be what he called a house without a roof. Göring looked at the wreckage, looked at Galland, looked back at the wreckage. Then he explained that the fighter had obviously been damaged somewhere over France, had climbed to altitude, and glided east before crashing. No American single-engine fighter could reach Germany under its own power. Anyone suggesting otherwise was defeatist. He used that word several times. Defeatist. He made it clear that this position, that American fighters had crossed into the Reich, was not to appear in any official document. Galland went back to his office. He wrote the conversation down in his diary, and he started waiting for reality to arrive at Göring's door on its own, because there was apparently no other way to get it there. It arrived, but by the time it did, the men who could have stopped it were already dying faster than Germany could replace them. Reality arrived on the 1st of December 1943. That was the day the 354th Fighter Group, newly arrived in England, flying a fighter that most of the 8th Air Force Command hadn't even seen yet, made its first combat sweep over Belgium in P-51BS. The Mustang with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, not the old Allison-powered version that had been shuttling around on low-altitude reconnaissance, the real one. The one that Ronald Harker had written his famous memo about 18 months earlier after flying a Mustang for 30 minutes and calculating, back at the Rolls-Royce facility at Hucknall, that putting a Merlin in that airframe would produce the finest fighter in the world. He had been right. On the 13th of December, that same group flew escort to Kiel, 480 miles into Germany and back. The previous record for American single-engine fighter escort was somewhere around 200 miles. The Luftwaffe fighter controllers who tracked the mission on radar didn't initially believe what they were seeing. Then came the 6th of March 1944. 730 heavy bombers, 800 fighters, including a full weight of Mustangs. Destination: Berlin. The Germans put up everything they had. 69 bombers didn't come home. The air battle was some of the most concentrated and violent aerial combat of the entire war. But the American fighters were there over Berlin, inbound and outbound, all the way. And when the survivors landed back in England that evening, a geographic fact that had seemed permanent had quietly ceased to be true. Berlin was no longer beyond the reach of American escort fighters. It never would be again. Now, here's the part of this story that tends to get lost when people talk about aircraft types and production numbers. By early 1944, a new German fighter pilot arriving at a frontline unit had, on average, 160 flying hours behind him. That number sounds workable until you put it next to what his American opponent had, roughly 400 to 500 hours, nearly half of them on the operational type he'd be flying in combat. 160 versus 500. That gap isn't just a training statistic. It shows up in the first real engagement. At 160 hours, you can fly the airplane. You know where the switches are. You can get it on the ground without bending the gear. But gunnery, real deflection shooting, leading a target moving at 400 miles an hour at a crossing angle, that takes hundreds of hours of practice to get right. Instrument flying in thick cloud, the kind that swallows a formation over Germany in November, takes practice. Situational awareness, knowing where your wingman is, where the threat is, where you are in three-dimensional space at the moment the first radio call comes through. That is not something you can shortcut. It is hours. It is repetition. It is making the same small decisions so many times that they stop being decisions. The German pilots coming into the line in 1944 hadn't had that time. Not because German instructors were bad, not because the training programs were badly designed. Because the fuel was running out, Allied bombing of synthetic oil plants was cutting into aviation fuel production starting in the spring of that year, and because there simply weren't enough hours left to give. By late 1944, the B flying schools had been dissolved entirely. A German fighter pilot was now sent to his unit directly from the A schools, with a total of around 112 hours, made up of 50 hours on elementary types, 40 at fighter school, and 20 at a replacement group. Some of that training was conducted on the ground, the pilot sitting in the cockpit of a stationary aircraft, walking through procedures, because there wasn't fuel to actually fly. Günther Lützow, one of the senior fighter commanders, put it plainly later. The young pilots they were getting by late 44 survived an average of 2 or 3 Reich defense missions before they were killed. 2 or 3 missions. Not enough to learn anything. Barely enough to be afraid. There's a scene from the Battle of Britain that tells you almost everything you need to know about the relationship between Galland and Göring, and why that relationship mattered so much to everything that followed. It was the late summer of 1940. The Luftwaffe was losing the air battle over southern England. The fighter wings were exhausted. The pilots were dying at a rate the training system couldn't replace. Göring flew to the Channel coast to confront his commanders, not to ask what had gone wrong, but to berate them for what he considered a failure of will. Then, in a gesture of paternal sarcasm, he went around the room asking each of them what they needed. When he got to Galland, Galland looked him in the face and said that if Göring had any to spare, he would like a unit of Spitfires for his men. He meant it as a compliment to the British aircraft, an acknowledgement that the machine they were fighting against was genuinely better suited to the conditions than what his pilots were flying. Göring turned around and walked out of the room without a word. That exchange stuck. For the rest of the war, every time Galland brought a problem to Göring, Göring heard it through the filter of that moment on the Channel coast. The fighter general who had asked for enemy aircraft instead of more German ones. The man who kept telling him things he didn't want to hear. And the thing is, Galland kept being right. He was right about the Spitfire. He was right about the fighter crashed near Aachen. He was right, from late 43 onward, that the Americans were about to produce a long-range escort fighter that would change the entire air war. Göring's response to being repeatedly told things he didn't want to hear by someone who kept being correct was not to start listening. It was to begin building a case that Galland was a defeatist, that the problem was Galland's attitude, not the actual situation. This is the mechanism. This is how the system worked. And it is the reason that in January of 45, Galland was listening on a telephone from a hallway instead of sitting in the room. Through 1944, Galland was fighting 2 wars simultaneously. One of them was in the air over Germany, which he was losing. The other was in conference rooms and on telephone lines with Göring, which he was also losing. He had a plan. He called it the große Schlag, the great blow. The logic was straightforward. The current approach, intercepting every American raid at maximum strength, sending whatever was available up against whatever came over, was a slow liquidation. Every mission cost pilots. The Americans had more pilots. The math ran in one direction. What if, instead, the Luftwaffe stopped bleeding itself out piecemeal? What if it pulled back, held its fighter units out of the daily grind for 2 or 3 months, built up a reserve of around 2,000 aircraft with their pilots rested and prepared, and then hit a single massive American formation with everything at once? Galland calculated that a coordinated attack of that size could destroy 400 to 500 bombers in one day. That would be a blow large enough to force the 8th Air Force to pause, to reconsider, to give Germany time to breathe. Göring rejected it. 3 months without major interceptions meant 3 months of American bombers flying over Germany essentially unopposed. Politically, that was impossible. Whatever the strategic logic, the optics were unacceptable. So instead of the great blow, they kept doing what they'd been doing, sending up whatever they had, losing 50 men a mission. watching the experienced pilots die and the inexperienced ones die faster. By the time Galland's proposal was formally shelved, the fuel shortage had made it moot anyway. The oil raids had done their work. German fighter units by the autumn of '44 could fly combat operations an average of roughly 4 days a month. The Americans flew every day the weather allowed. The pilots who would have carried out the great blow, the 2,000 Galland wanted to hold in reserve, rested, prepared, ready, were already dead. Most of them had been dead for months. There was no reserve left to unleash. There never would be. On the 1st of January 1945, the Luftwaffe launched the largest single operation it had attempted in over a year. Operation Bodenplatte, baseplate. 1,035 aircraft hitting 16 Allied airfields in Belgium, the Netherlands, and France simultaneously, arriving at low level just after dawn on New Year's morning. The Allied pilots were, as one German commander put it, expected to be sleeping off their celebrations. Some were. Many weren't. Anti-aircraft guns across the region opened up on the low-flying attackers, including, in a detail that still seems almost impossible, German anti-aircraft batteries that hadn't been told about the operation for secrecy reasons. Somewhere between a fifth and a quarter of the Luftwaffe's losses that day came from their own guns. The operation achieved real damage. Around 305 Allied aircraft destroyed on the ground, another 190 damaged. The Allied airfields had been caught partially off guard. By any tactical measure, the attack worked. Then the accounting came in. The Luftwaffe had lost 271 fighters. More critically, it had lost around 215 pilots, killed, captured, wounded. Among them were more than 60 of the more experienced ones, wing commanders, group leaders, the men who knew how to coordinate an attack, how to manage a formation under fire, how to bring the younger pilots home. The Allies replaced their destroyed aircraft within a week. Germany had no equivalent replacement for what it had just spent. Hitler's Luftwaffe adjutant, Nikolaus von Below, wrote in his diary that day, "A catastrophe befell the Luftwaffe." Galland described Bodenplatte later as the death knell of the fighter arm. The operation he had spent 2 years arguing against, the piecemeal expenditure of irreplaceable experienced pilots for tactical results that could never be strategic, had just happened at maximum scale in a single morning. 19 days later, on the 19th of January 1945, a cold morning in Berlin, snow on the streets outside, the city already showing the damage of years of bombing. The meeting happened that Galland had been building toward for 2 years. Karl Kohler, chief of the Luftwaffe General Staff, had arranged it. A group of senior fighter pilots would meet with Göring at the Haus der Fliege on Prinz Albrechtstrasse and present their concerns formally. The group included Günther Lützow, Johannes Steinhoff, Hannes Trautloft, Gustav Rödel, Eduard Neumann. Combined, they had thousands of combat missions between them. Lützow had 110 aerial victories. Steinhoff had 176. These were not junior officers afraid of conflict. These were the men who had built the Luftwaffe's fighter reputation from Poland through the Battle of Britain, through North Africa, and back to the skies over Germany itself. Galland was not in the room. He had been relieved of his command in early January, and while he had arranged for the meeting to happen, he wasn't invited to attend. He listened on an open telephone line from an adjacent office. Lützow spoke for the group. He'd asked Göring beforehand not to interrupt, told him directly that if Göring kept cutting people off the way he always did, nothing would get accomplished. Göring agreed. Then Lützow laid it out. The accusations of cowardice being directed at pilots who broke off combat against overwhelming odds. The waste of the fighter reserve in operations like Bodenplatte. The Me-262 jet fighter, a machine that could genuinely change the balance of the air war, being misused and mismanaged. The dismissal of Galland, who had the trust of virtually the entire fighter arm. They were not asking for sympathy. They were telling Göring that his decisions were destroying what was left of the force. They wanted Galland reinstated. They wanted the jets used as interceptors. They wanted to stop being blamed for losing a war that the command had lost for them. Steinhoff, by his own account, told Göring directly, "Your Jagdwaffe is still in a position to relieve the country by putting at least a temporary halt to the bomb horror." At that point, Göring stopped agreeing to listen. He called them mutineers. He threatened Lützow with death for high treason, told him he would be shot. He threatened Steinhoff with court-martial and immediate exile to Italy. He placed Galland under a form of house arrest pending a formal investigation. The men who had built the Luftwaffe's fighter arm, who had told the truth about what was happening to it, were punished for doing so. From the adjacent room, listening through the telephone, Galland could hear everything. There was nothing left for him to say that he hadn't already said. What happened next contains the only piece of dark irony in this story that Göring probably didn't intend as a gift to his enemies. Rather than having Galland quietly removed, which would have required a formal proceeding and generated the kind of attention Göring didn't want, he gave him an assignment. Galland would form a small jet fighter unit. He would prove, or fail to prove, his long-standing claim that the Me-262, used as an interceptor, could change the air war. He would do this at squadron level, at the rank of wing commander, stripped of the broader command authority he'd held for 3 years. The implied message was, go get yourself killed, proving you were right, since you're so certain of it. Galland accepted. He called Johannes Steinhoff, the man Göring had just exiled to Italy. He reached out to Günther Lützow, Gerhard Backhorn, Walter Krupinski, Heinz Beer, Erich Hohagen. One by one, through February and into March of '45, they came. The unit they formed was called Jagdverband 44. Its informal nickname among the Luftwaffe was the Galland Circus. A more accurate nickname, which circulated quietly among those who knew the caliber of the pilots involved, was the Squadron of Experts. Think about what that unit actually was. At a moment when the average German fighter pilot arriving at a frontline unit had around 100 flying hours and could expect to survive 2 or 3 missions, JV-44 was assembling men who had between them more than 1,000 aerial victories. Backhorn alone had 301, Steinhoff had 176, Lützow had 110. Galland himself had 104. Steinhoff later described the training program he ran for the unit. I adopted a fairly informal approach to conversion training on the Me-262, feeling that time was running short. We had no instruction manuals or visual aids, and the lessons were held in the open air, with all of us squatting on the earthworks that had been thrown up around the jets. Open air instruction. Squatting in the dirt. The finest collection of fighter pilots Germany had produced, being trained on revolutionary aircraft with no manuals, because there was no time for anything else, and the war was 17 weeks from ending. They flew their first missions in late March. By early April, they were operational over Munich, hitting American bomber formations with R-4M rockets, a new unguided weapon that could be fired from beyond the range of the bomber's defensive guns. In the few weeks they were active, the unit claimed around 47 Allied aircraft, a kill ratio of 4-to-1. It was extraordinary. It was also completely irrelevant to the outcome of the war. On the 26th of April, 1945, Galland led an attack on a formation of B-26 Marauders over Munich. A 22-year-old P-47 pilot named James Finnegan, flying with the 10th Fighter Squadron of the 50th Fighter Group, got onto his tail. Hits on the right engine, hits around the cockpit area. Galland managed to break away, coaxed the damaged aircraft back toward the airfield at Munich Riem, and put it down. Hard, damaged, but down. He climbed out with a wound to his knee. It was his 705th combat sortie of the war. His last. Here is the part of this story that doesn't announce itself. On the 18th of April, 1945, 8 days before Galland's last flight, Johannes Steinhoff was taking off from a JV-44 airfield at the head of a formation. It was going to be his 900th combat mission. The Me-262 suffered a technical failure on the takeoff roll. The aircraft ground-looped, shed its landing gear, caught fire. Steinhoff survived, with burns over 80% of his body, both legs broken. His face, which had been the face of one of the most decorated pilots in the Luftwaffe, was a single wound. He spent 2 years in hospitals, dozens of reconstructive surgeries over the following years. After the war, Johannes Steinhoff became one of the founding officers of the Bundesluftwaffe, the Air Force of the new Western Germany. He rose to the rank of general and served as chairman of the NATO Military Committee. The man that Göring had threatened with court-martial for telling the truth about the state of the fighter arm became one of the most senior military officers in the Western Alliance. He never stopped flying. On the 1st of May, 1945, Galland was lying in a hospital bed in Bavaria with a wounded knee, unable to walk, the war 9 days from ending. Outside the window, he could hear artillery, distant, rolling, getting closer from the west. He had a notepad on his chest and a pen in his hand. He was writing a letter to General Eisenhower. Not a surrender document, a negotiation. He wanted a specific arrangement for JV-44, the pilots and the aircraft, to fall into American hands, not Soviet, and a guarantee that no one would be shot during the handover. He dictated it carefully, the way he had always written things that mattered. No room for misreading, no room for someone to pretend they hadn't understood. 2 of his aides took the letter, climbed into a liaison aircraft, and flew it across the lines to Schleißheim. The Americans read it, discussed it, and sent word back. Agreed. The remaining Me-262s were handed over intact. American engineers took them apart with the kind of attention you give something you intend to rebuild. On the 14th of May, Galland was taken prisoner. He was not prosecuted, no evidence of war crimes, no case to make. Released in 47. His first job after captivity was lecturing on fighter tactics for the Royal Air Force. The same Air Force he'd spent 5 years trying to shoot down over the Channel. In 48, he went to Argentina, flew the British Gloucester Meteor for the Argentine Air Force, a jet built by the country he had fought. In 54, he wrote his memoir. He called it The First and the Last. Returned to Germany in 55, opened a consulting firm, married 3 times, flew until his body wouldn't let him anymore. On the 9th of February, 1996, he died in Remagen-Oberwinter. He was 83. He is buried at the St. Laurentius Church in the same town, a small cemetery quiet on the Rhine. In 1979, a historian named Henry Sakida introduced Galland to James Finnegan, the 22-year-old P-47 pilot who had shot him down on the 26th of April, 1945. They met in California. Finnegan explained that the Me-262 he had hit over Munich was his only confirmed kill of the entire war, his one and only. Galland apparently found this worth laughing about. 705 sorties ended by a pilot for whom it was Mission 1. They talked for a while. 2 old men in California, in 1979, remembering April. Now we can answer the question from the beginning. Why couldn't Galland stop what he could see coming? Not because he was wrong. He was right about almost everything. The long-range escort threat, the pilot attrition rate, the need to conserve the fighter reserve, the potential of the Me-262 as an interceptor. He was right, and he knew he was right, and his superiors knew he was right. And it didn't matter. It didn't matter because the system he was inside had been built around a single assumption that ran through every level of it. The war would be short. That assumption was baked into the fighter ranges, the pilot training pipelines, the production priorities, the doctrine, the command structure. Germany, in 1939, had organized itself magnificently for a short war. It had created a military instrument of genuine brilliance for campaigns of weeks or months, fast, sharp, devastating at the point of application. What it had not built was a system that could learn. When the war didn't end in weeks, and then didn't end in months, the system had no mechanism for updating its fundamental assumptions. Because every decision of any significance had to go through Göring, and Göring had to agree, and Göring had decided in his own mind that the war was being won, or at least not being lost, the system could not incorporate the information that it was actually being lost. Officers who provided that information were called defeatists. The information itself was classified. The gap between what the situation actually was and what the command believed it to be grew wider, slowly, until it was a chasm. The American system worked differently. Not perfectly. There were bad decisions and bad commanders throughout. But in January of 1944, James Doolittle took command of the 8th Air Force, sat down with the loss reports from the previous 6 months, and made a decision that his own bomber crews hated him for. He took the fighter escorts off the leash. No more close formation escort. The Mustangs would sweep ahead of the bombers, hunt freely on the way in, roam on the way home, strafe airfields whenever a target presented itself. His bomber crews sent up complaints through every channel available. They wanted their fighters visible, close, reassuring. Doolittle told them the fighters were doing more good killing Germans than flying next to them. He didn't need Roosevelt's sign-off. He didn't need Göring's permission. He looked at what the data said, made the call, and it worked. The Mustangs went hunting, and the Luftwaffe's experienced pilot corps started dying at a rate it couldn't survive. 2 systems in the same sky. One could adapt when the situation changed. The other could only demand that its people fight harder in a situation that had already changed without them. There's a chain of people who made what happened in the skies over Germany in 1944 possible. And each of them did something specific, with their hands, that changed the outcome. Edgar Schmoot, born in the Rhineland-Palatinate, emigrated to Brazil in 1925 and then to the United States, drew the airframe. The laminar flow wing profile, the belly radiator scoop, the clean lines that made the Mustang faster than anything in its class. He drew it in 117 days at a drafting table in Inglewood, California. Ronald Harker, test pilot for Rolls-Royce, flew a Mustang for 30 minutes on the 30th of April, 1942, and the next morning wrote a 1-page memorandum. "Put the Merlin in this airframe," he wrote, "and it will be the finest fighter in the world." Without that page, the P-51B doesn't exist. Witold Chandier, a Polish aerodynamicist who had escaped occupied Poland in '39, ran the calculations at Rolls-Royce's facility at Hucknall that confirmed what Harker had written. His slide rule predicted 441 miles per hour at 25,600 feet. He was right. James Doolittle unleashed them. Donald Blakesley led them to Berlin on the 6th of March, 1944, and proved it was possible. And Galland did something too. He documented what was happening with a precision and honesty that was, within the system he served, genuinely dangerous. The reports he wrote in 1943 and 44 about pilot attrition, about the coming long-range escort threat, about the death of the fighter arm, became some of the most important primary sources historians have for understanding how air power actually failed in that war. He couldn't stop it, but he recorded it accurately enough that we can still trace exactly where it broke. That's not nothing. In 1979, in California, Galland sat across from the young man who had ended his war on the 26th of April, 1945. James Finnegan told him it was his only kill. Galland heard this and laughed. 705 sorties, 33 years of flying, Spain, France, England, North Africa, Germany, 4 times shot down and walking away, 104 confirmed victories, 2 years as the commander of every fighter pilot in Germany, and then 1 P-47 pilot on his one and only successful engagement. The war had strange arithmetic. But here's the thing that actually stays with you when you look at the full arc of this. The Luftwaffe's fighter pilots were not defeated because they were worse pilots. Many of them were better. In the one-on-one individual contest of skill, the German aces were fighting at a standard that very few people in history have matched. They were defeated because the system that sent them into the air had made a series of decisions, some of them years before the war started, that eventually made the outcome inevitable. Short war assumptions built into long war machinery, a command structure that punished honest information instead of using it, a training pipeline that ran dry just when it needed to run hardest. Galland saw all of this. He said all of this. He was right about all of this. And the pilots he was trying to protect, the young ones with 100 hours and 2 or 3 missions left, they never knew his name. They climbed into their cockpits in the morning, flew what they'd been told to fly, and didn't come back. Most of Galland's generation didn't make it to that California afternoon in 1979. Most of them are still somewhere over Germany, still over France, still over England. What stayed behind was Galland's record of what happened. Written down, classified, unsealed, read. The cost of not listening to the people who know what they're talking about, measured in pilots, measured in missions, measured, in the end, in everything. If this story was worth your time, a like on this video helps these longer, carefully sourced investigations reach the people looking for exactly this kind of history. Not the simplified version, the one with the real names and the real numbers and the parts that don't fit neatly. Subscribe to Victory Vault if you want the next chapter. There are a lot more of these to tell. Each one is about a system, how it was built, what it assumed, what it missed, and what it cost when the bill came due.